Hi, Anthony Dillon here, again to talk to you about Aboriginal issues. And in this video I'd like to talk about closing the gap, how we can help Aboriginal people lead the same sorts of lifestyles, standard of living as what most of us take for granted. Now, over the years there have been many people, academics, government organisations, NGOs, people in community-based organisations working hard to try and make a difference. And while we've seen some small gains, we haven't quite seen the level of change that we would have hoped for given the investment. And I think that's a real problem. And the reason why we haven't seen those gains is because we've been thinking about these problems the wrong way. And so what we need to do is get some fresh thinking, some new ideas, a new way of looking at Aboriginal affairs. And in this video, that's what I'd like to do, is offer you some fresh perspectives on how to close the gap. So to help you understand what I mean by fresh perspectives, if you have a look at this picture here, most of you will see a horse, okay, a nice friendly looking horse. But if you look real carefully, without me changing the picture at all, you might be able to see a frog. Now, just to help you, I'm not going to change the picture, I'm just going to change the perspective or the orientation. Now can you see the frog? So it's gone from being a horse to a frog without changing the content of the picture, but just simply by changing the perspective or the orientation. And so it is with Aboriginal affairs. We need to look at the whole business, Aboriginal affairs, relationships with non-Indigenous people, everything. We need to look at it from a different perspective and bring in some new ideas. Okay then, so to close the gap, I'm going to offer 5 points, which they're not a definitive list, but I think they are 5 points that will help give us a different perspective. It'll help us attack the problem of Indigenous disadvantage differently to what it has been done in the past. And the first point I wish to make is we need to focus on what I call the internal gap or the within gap. So not so much the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but if we look at Indigenous people, we see that we have some Indigenous people like myself and my peers that live in a city. We have access to health services, fresh food, all the sorts of things that most Australians take for granted. We have those up at one end, but at the other end, we have those Indigenous people where we know their plight. We read about it in the media. We know that they're suffering dysfunction, disadvantage. They live in unclean and unsafe environments. We need to focus on this gap here, and we do that by focusing on the most disadvantaged and saying, okay, what do we need to do to ensure that they have safe, clean living environments, that the adults are working, that the kids are in school? What do we need to do to make that happen? We focus on them, and that will move their standard of living, their outcomes up to the other Indigenous people. So we close that internal or that within gap. Rather than just focusing on the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, where often a lot of the resources gets focused on those Indigenous people who are doing well, we need to look at those Indigenous people who are not doing so well and close that within or internal gap. So the second point I want to talk about is that, very simply, Aboriginal affairs is everyone's business. For far too long, there have been Aboriginal gurus and gatekeepers who have kept out non-Aboriginal people from participating in the discussion. They've been made to feel inferior, that their experience doesn't matter, and they've controlled everything. Well, again, I'm here to tell you, Aboriginal affairs is everyone's business. For you as a non-Aboriginal person, it's your right to get involved in Aboriginal affairs as much as you want. Your opinion matters, and you shouldn't be silenced by non-Aboriginal affairs. So I firmly believe we're only going to close that gap when all Australians feel free to participate in the debate, the conversation, and make the contributions they want to make. If we go down this path of only Aboriginal people can have an opinion on Aboriginal people, only Aboriginal people can help Aboriginal people, we're only going to further the gap. We're going to get this separatism, we're going to get isolation, and that does nothing for reconciliation. So be assured, Aboriginal affairs is everyone's business. The third point I want to make, closely following from the second point, is that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people have far much in common than what there are differences. For far too long, again, the gatekeepers and the gurus have been presenting a picture of Aboriginal people as if they were a completely different species of people to non-Aboriginal Australians, and that's not the case. The commonalities far outweigh the differences. And look, certainly there are some differences, but they are not the be-all and end-all, and they are not the most important aspects of the people. The commonalities, they're human commonalities, and Aboriginal people are people first, Aboriginal second, and that's how we've got to view this, that they are people first. They are Australians, and again, therefore, it's all Australians' business, Aboriginal affairs. And certainly, you know, where there are differences, for example, let's suppose there are language differences or whatever, you may need an interpreter, and that's great. You cater to those differences. But the foundation or the starting point for helping Aboriginal people should be that recognition that essentially Aboriginal people are the same as non-Aboriginal people. We have the same needs, desires, wants. There's much alike, and that should be celebrated. That should be the starting point for celebration, and only then should we start to consider the differences. Okay, the next point I want to talk about is this belief that racism is everywhere, it's rampant, and that it's holding Aboriginal people back. Let me state up front that yes, racism exists in this country as it does in every country, and yes, Aboriginal people are subject to racism, but nowhere near to the degree which some people would have you believe. Now, I know of some people, academics, political leaders who have carved out a nice niche for themselves in promoting this message that racism is what holds Aboriginal people back. It is not, and we need to move beyond that. We need to realise that Australia, white Australia, if you want to use that term, love Aboriginal people and their country. We celebrate Aboriginal people in this country. We have a high rate of intermarriage. We have Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people working alongside of one another, living alongside of one another, getting on well. Racism is not the big issue that's holding Aboriginal people back. I'll be talking about this in another video because it's such an important topic, and the myth needs to be challenged. But for now, I think we just need to state and make it known that racism against Aboriginal people is not the big culprit that holds them back. And for as long as we promote that message that it's holding them back, Aboriginal people will be held back. Now, the final point, if we want to close the gap, is that tough decisions need to be made. So whether you're a politician, a community leader, a person of influence like you're a television presenter, tough decisions need to be made and the debate needs to be put out there. So, for example, a big one, remote communities. Now, I'm all for keeping people in remote communities if they are well serviced and the people are doing well, but far too many communities that people are not doing well, and tough decisions need to be made, tough questions need to be asked. What do you do with the people there? Do you leave them there so that their children just keep repeating the cycle? Or do you have an exit strategy for them? These are really tough decisions. Another one, the use and ban of alcohol. You might have a community where some people manage and use alcohol responsibly, but there is a critical mass who don't, and it creates havoc for the community. Tough decisions need to be made within that community. Do you ban, do you restrict, or what? These are really tough decisions, and this is the same for the general community as well. Just tough decisions need to be made. But when it comes to Aboriginal affairs, often we're too afraid to even discuss or talk about what the problems are and what decisions need to be made. And for as long as we're afraid to make decisions, offer solutions that may be unpopular, we're never going to close that gap.